Welcome to the SWIKE podcast, the only podcast that shares the stuff you didn't know you needed to know about jobs, careers, and life. The SWIKE podcast, the stuff I wish I knew earlier.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the SWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier podcast. We're here again with our guest host, Steve Joordens. Steve, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Luki. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic as always. And we thought we'd have Steve back and have a conversation about feedback. Steve runs Peer Scholar, which is all about feedback, peer feedback, and he also kind of teaches folks to give feedback as well. And when we talk about feedback, we're not talking about like the screeching humming sound when like an amp and a mic and a speaker get together. We're talking about like the comments, about performance and how to improve and get better and all that sort of stuff. So that's what we're talking about here. So I love, Steve, if you chatted a little bit about what is feedback to you and maybe the first instance when you either got or gave feedback, if you can recall back in time when one of those instances were.
The very first instance. Well, I can tell sort of I guess a bit of a weird story, which is an odd one for feedback. But there was a time when my father was he was part of the UN peacekeepers, and he was stationed in Cyprus at the time. And for whatever reason, once the family could come and visit, and so me and my older sisters went to visit. I have this memory of driving around Cyprus, and at one point there was a gentleman with a camel that was offering rides on this camel, and my three sisters in turn each went on the camel, and if any of you have seen a camel, you know when it gets up sort of like back end up really, really high first, and then front end up, and I would watch my sisters lurch back one way and lurch the other way, and then it was my turn, and when it was my turn, I was scared. I was young at the time. I think I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. I can't remember exactly. And it scared the heck out of me. And I simply refused. I had a full meltdown and said I wouldn't do it. The feedback that I think of is I remember to this day driving away in the car and feeling my father's disappointment. So this wasn't even verbal feedback. I don't think he said anything. I think it was just the way he was behaving let me know that he was disappointed in me. And to this day, I have this term I carry around, damn camel, where anytime I feel something's challenging and I feel like, I want to back away from it, I can sort of feel that reaction, that disappointment in my father, and I don't want to feel that again. And so it's sort of something I carry with me that shapes my behavior going forward, I believe.
That's interesting. And on a side note, have you ever ridden on a camel since then?
I have not. I've not really had the opportunity. I mean, I guess I have the opportunity now and I certainly would if I have, but I do equally crazy things, maybe more crazy things on a semi-regular basis. And that I think was a little bit of the impetus. I think literally that little bit of feedback, although it was a real deep emotional, kind of interaction for me, I think it did shape who I became. And that's really what feedback, we often talk about it being what we call formative. And the idea is we should be more comfortable having people throw out something and be more comfortable. If we ask them to do something rather than saying, I don't know how to do something, what we'd wish is they try something. But then with feedback, with information from other sources about what was good about what they did and what wasn't good about what they did, they can hopefully shape their behavior and create a better product. So this notion of what we might call a revisionist mindset, continually trying to improve something.
That's awesome. And if any of our listeners out there want to give Steve an opportunity to ride a camel, then feel free to reach out to him. Maybe I'll take you up on that.
That'd be cool.
But, as we talk a little bit more about, oh, yeah, one of the two.
I'll do either one.
As we talk about feedback, then because they're interrelated in terms of giving and receiving feedback. So if we were to, or if you were to start the conversation, where would you start? Would you start more on the giving side or the receiving side? How would you approach that conversation?
I actually, when we try to formally teach this, I'm a big fan of saying start with the giving, because there's a funny aspect to feedback. We don't always appreciate the emotional aspect of it. So for example, I sometimes speak to teachers about feedback, and sometimes there's this naive view that students are just waiting for you to tell them what's wrong with their work. Like
Right.
they're eager to get this constructive feedback that they can use. But in reality, there's something called a fight-flight reflex, that anytime we feel we are being threatened in any way, and that includes like social embarrassment of not doing something well, we generally want to fight or flee that reaction. But what we find is that people are largely unaware of that. Even educators are kind of unaware of how powerful the fight or flee is. So I really like to introduce this to students when they're giving feedback first. And I like to say, hey, this thing exists. And then we guide them through a process that we'll probably talk about a little bit about how to give feedback that minimally triggers that. You're never going to completely avoid it, but at least you're going to try to minimally trigger it. And so to have them kind of engage in that and think about it abstractly first, and then to have them on the other side where we say, hey, remember that fight or flee we talked about? Well, now you're going to feel it. Once you start to see the feedback of your work, you're going to feel it. So I kind of like introducing it in the abstract and then making it really concrete to them when they're on the receiving side.
Sounds good. So if we could walk through maybe an example of how you might teach someone to give feedback appropriately. So is there a couple of steps, a good acronym or something that we could remember in order to do that?
This really is, I think, an important point, because I think so often, we have feedback within our education system, and we're used to just giving people feedback, but we don't usually walk through, even with teachers, we don't teach them the difficulties associated with feedback. So when we have students go through this process, we've created some so-called micro-learning videos, and it's all part of what I call knowledge-informed practice. And what we mean by that is we want to give them the knowledge of how to do something, but then almost immediately we want to say, okay, now put this knowledge to use. And because it's really when you start using that knowledge that it really becomes embodied and you really get it. And so when we try to give students a good sense of the challenge of feedback, we really hit on a couple things. So I'm going to mention a psychology theory called self-determination theory. And it says if you want anybody to embrace anything, to become engaged in anything, there's 3 needs you have to meet. The first one is autonomy. They have to be doing it because they see value, like they want to be doing, not because somebody's telling them to do that. We've seen this with the vaccine mandate, by the way. What happens when you violate autonomy, when you push someone to do something, suddenly they don't want to do it. And so we always have a video that tries to explain to students, here's the value of learning to be a good feedback giver. This is what's in it for you, how it's going to result in more success in your life. And so that's to get their buy-in, the sort of why. Why are you doing this? But then we work on the second factor, which is competence. So often, the people who give feedback don't know how to do it well. They don't understand the challenge, and that's the next thing we do. Here's the challenge of giving feedback, and here's why it's difficult. And let me throw this example out to your listeners, because sometimes people say, is it really? I don't know if I believe this fight or flee. And so I like to say the following. Imagine you're at your workplace and you're getting an award, and they're going to have an evening where they're going to highlight you and the award you've gotten. So you're looking forward to this. And they said you can bring your significant other along. So you invite your significant other, and as you see them coming, you realize they're not dressed appropriately for this event. You're kind of embarrassed by the clothing choices they've made. What do you do? And so once I put people in that situation, I will usually say, well, how many do nothing? And I would raise my hand usually, and I would just do nothing. I would just say, whatever. I'm not going to say a word. Those who do say they would say something, I say, would you be careful with your words? And invariably they're like, yes, I would be very careful. And I say, well, why would you be very careful? And they would say, well, because if I don't say it right, the person's going to say, just go to your stupid event by yourself. I didn't want to go with you anyway, whatever. That's how easy it is to trigger the fight flight. When you criticize somebody at all, even just the clothes they're wearing to an event, that can be enough to produce this sort of reaction. And so students and educators need to understand that. And then with that as context, we say, okay, here are 5 or 6 tips about how to present your feedback in a way that hopefully won't trigger that phenomenon too much. And so we kind of put students through all of these videos, and then we say, okay, now look at, say, 6 of your peers' work. And it's all anonymous, it's all randomly selected. And basically do that. Give them positive feedback, which we haven't talked about too much yet. I've really been focusing on constructive, but give them some positive feedback, highlight something good about what they did. But then everything you just learned, put it into practice. Read this person's work, try to find a way it could be improved, but now communicate that to them in a way that you think they will actually receive. And so when you're aware of the fight flight, now they have guidance, and now they can practice those, 5 or 6 characteristics and try to give it in what some of us call now a socio-emotionally appropriate way. So you're giving the feedback in a way that won't make that other person angry or upset. Hopefully they'll be thankful. If you do it well, they will see you as somebody who's trying to help them improve. And that's the ultimate goal.
That's amazing. So on that, you mentioned 3 things. So there's autonomy, competency, and a third one? Or did we?
The third one is relatedness. So relatedness means, and you can imagine this, if it's your karate group or whatever as well, you have to be there because you want to be there. You have to feel some level of competence. This is why they give you instruction before they ask you to do something, so you kind of know what to do. Mm-hmm. But you also want to feel like you're part of a cohort, that these people you're with are learning with you. And there's a sort of connection amongst the learning group. And we don't specifically include that in the instruction that we give because it's more part naturally of the process. Our process is students helping each other improve their work before the professor sees it. And so, literally by having 5 or 6 peers say, hey, here's how I think your work could be better, we're kind of building up that sort of pro-social nature where students are helping students. And we have shown in some of our research that increases the sense of community, especially in large and online classes. So if it's one of these ones where you feel like you're just one person amongst a bunch in a class, sure. As soon as you get in this atmosphere where you're starting to help each other improve the work, that makes you feel more connected to your fellow peers. So that enhances relatedness. So autonomy, competence, and relatedness are the 3 pillars of self-determination theory.
That's awesome. And then you mentioned like 5 or 6 tips so that not to trigger, and a couple of videos that are there. So obviously we'll try to link to those. Are they available publicly that they can access?
Yeah, videos.peerscholar.com has those videos that we use when we guide people through feedback. And it has other videos too, for example, when we ask them to work as teams. That's something that we often do as educators, but we don't, again, instruct and inform students about the challenges and give them strategies for how to meet those challenges. So we have some videos there like that as well, which would, welcome anybody can go there and use those videos as they see fit.
Sounds good. And if you were to pick your...
Yeah, sorry.
No, I was going to say if you're going to pick your top tip for them, just to make it tangible, because obviously we don't want to reiterate everything that's in the videos, but to give folks something tangible to look at. What should they do as like the top or your number one tip if you were to only have a short podcast to teach someone?
The most interesting tip that I think is illustrative of the whole idea. I mean, some of them are pretty obvious, like don't attack the person. Attack their work. I mean, attack is the wrong word anyway, but to the extent you're criticizing, make sure it's about the work and not the person. So it's not, here's what you do wrong, but here's something in your work that could be changed. But the one that's kind of cool comes from a guy named John Hattie in Australia and others. And they argue that in fact, the word feedback is flawed and that we should be thinking of it as feed forward. And the idea there is if you're trying to build this sort of revisionist mindset where people are continually improving drafts, then instead of focusing on the draft and saying, okay, you wrote this draft and here are 2 or 3 things that I think are not very good about it. That's hard on the person because there's nothing they can do about it. They've written the draft. It's sitting there, okay, you're just criticizing me. But if instead you say, okay, I read your draft and I know you're going to do a revision. As you consider that revision, here's 2 or 3 things you could do that would make that revision better than your draft. And so we're looking forward now. We're talking to the person about something they can do to make something they're going to do better. And that's immediately much more doable. And it feels like you're trying to help them reach that better spot, not just criticizing what they've done. So that concept of always instruct the student thinking about how you're going to help them get to a better spot in the future is a much better way, and it reduces that sort of defensive fight or flight reaction.
That's awesome. So hopefully with just that little tidbit, folks will be better feed forward givers, I guess is what we'll rebrand it. And I guess on the other side, if we want to prepare folks that eventually they will receive some feedback, feed forward or commentary or whatever we want to call it, how could we kind of prepare ourselves, steel ourselves for the upcoming onslaught to be better receivers of feedback or whatever you want to call it, feed forward?
And we have another set of videos specifically for that, for when they're on the receiving end, because that's where the rubber really hits the road. I mean, really what we're trying to teach students, especially in the context of constructive feedback, is that it's not fun. When you're doing that performance evaluation every year and you're sitting in front of your boss, don't expect to feel good about what happens in there, because almost any time somebody is giving you ideas of how you can improve, they have to highlight certain things that are currently not optimal. And when they do that, you will feel that fight or flight. So one of the things we tell students is acknowledge it and recognize it. So the first thing, when we actually ask them questions about every bit of feedback to make sure that they don't flee. So in our context, you can't flee the feedback. You have to read it because we ask you various questions about it. But they are questions like, how negatively emotional did that make you feel? And you can rate it. You can let the feedback giver know. But then you can also, then we say, okay, now try to get past that emotion and get to the actual content. What was that person suggesting? Can you put it in your own words? So we try to push the student to acknowledge that the emotion is there, but then say, okay, despite that, however you feel, what was that person trying to say? And that's the core thing we're trying to teach them. And that's what we all have to learn. And we have this analogy in the scientific community all the time that when we submit a paper, it's reviewed by 3 other people. It is sort of the same process. They write feedback to us, basically often saying why the current paper is not good enough to be published. And when we read that feedback, we almost always think they are idiots. We read the thing and we're like, it feels very antagonistic. You walk away and then you come back a day later and they're not nearly as idiotic. And 2 or 3 days later, they actually got some good points. And then eventually, once you incorporate their ideas into the new draft, you think this is better. And so that's the road you have to go down of sort of having that initial emotional reaction, but then sort of persevering and saying, okay, I'm going to try to listen to what that person said, even though it didn't make me feel good. And then when students get to that point of creating the revision, they almost always say it was worth it. That was cool. I like my paper better. I'm going to get a better grade because of listening to what those students have said. And so that's what we're trying to incentivize, to push them to kind of learn that feedback doesn't feel good, but that it has great value if you can negotiate that negative emotional space. And that's not easy. It's not natural.
For sure. And a lot of what you provided is largely in the student context, right? Getting assignments, getting grades, having papers reviewed by peers and stuff like that. How does, if at all, does that change within like a work context? So if you're an employer doing, like you mentioned, a performance review for someone else, is receiving and giving feedback that much different, or is it pretty much the same, just with a different hat on it or whatever?
I mean, I think it's largely the same story, but it's so critical in the work environment because we know that innovation and productivity in any work environment is often critically dependent on how well the members of that environment can work as a team. And teamwork works really well when people can listen to one another and when they are able to allow other people's ideas or other people's reaction to their ideas to help them shape to get to a better place. So you want to start, like, imagine a brainstorming session at a work environment. You want to start by just getting as many bad ideas out or as many ideas out as possible. And then you start to sort of think about, okay, how can we take these rough ideas and come to something that's really good and really polished? And that does require people to be able to talk in ways where they can say negative things about other people's ideas. And so, there's the leader talking to the people in a performance appraisal situation. And there it is so important that they do it in a way that's sensitive to this other person as a human being. And so a leader that understands the fight or flee, that takes the time to present that constructive feedback in a human and emotionally sensitive way, that's going to be a leader people like and respect. And then when they can pass that down, I really think that in a lot of business contexts, it's great to first teach the leaders how to give good feedback, but then you want to bring it right down and demystify it. This is what they're doing. It's not mysterious. They're trying to be sensitive to this negative reaction we all have. And so they're using their feedback in this way. And by the way, when you guys are working in teams, you should be using this too. And the more that can become the context of a work environment, the better the social connection amongst people will be. And the data is overwhelming that when you have good social connection in the workplace, when people like the people they're working with, then you have so much more productivity, so much more efficiency. And so it all kind of comes down to that human socio-emotional communication. And I think it may even be more critical in the workplace. In fact, in the university, I think what I'm trying to do is get my students to a point so that when they're in the workplace, they have these skills a little more ingrained, and therefore they're going to just thrive where other people, might not, because they're not ready to accept that negative feedback.
Yeah. So it sounds like whether you're in school or in work, it's kind of the same model where ideally starting with the leaders, the givers of the feedback, and when they kind of model that behavior, then the employees down the chain, their teams, they'll do the same thing, and then everyone improves the culture. They start working together as in a team context a lot better. And you mentioned that a lot of the stuff we've been talking about is in the constructive feedback context, but you also mentioned the power of positive feedback. So I'd love if we spent a little bit of time, because obviously that's very important as well. So if you can spend a little bit of time on positive feedback, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. And that's, that's something that I had to kind of come to appreciate. I think we so undervalue and underutilize it well. And so if we kind of think of it from the receiver point of view, first of all, I've been talking a lot about, hey, if someone's criticizing you, you have this natural fight-flight reflex. And so if we think of positive feedback, if someone's saying something good about you, there is no fight-flight. There's quite the opposite. There's like an open-armed embrace. Anything positive, we will just, no defense mechanism there. We want to take it in. But what's really important is that the person who gives the positive feedback does it right. And there's a couple of components to doing it right. One of it is being specific. So highlighting a very specific thing that person did. And so, what I imagine if I was an employer and, let's just take a silly example for now. Let's say I had one of my people on my team came in late on a semi-regular basis. And, I would prefer them to come in at the same time. It's kind of hurting the culture when this person seems to be behaving differently. I could focus on their negative behavior and I could give them constructive feedback around that. But another option is that, when they do come in on time, and that's something that's good, we can really choose that as an opportunity to say, oh, great. It's really fantastic that you're here ahead of time. That will really make the whole team feel like, you're a team player. Thank you. And it allows you to send that same message, but in a way that this person is much more likely to embrace because you're saying something positive. And then they're going to want to be that more. And so also, let's do a more esoteric example. Let's say you have a team member that is smart, but they're very introverted. And when you're having brainstorming sessions or something, they tend to sit quietly in the back and you would love to know what's on their mind because you suspect they have some good ideas. You should just wait for that person to once, open their mouth and say something. And then, after that meeting, if you're a leader, to just take them aside and say, hey, that was really great what you said there. I think that added a lot of value to the discussion. Fantastic. Thank you. That will be the best way to make them feel more comfortable doing that in the future. So you want to be very specific, but you also don't want to go overboard. It's a question. It's sort of like salt, positive feedback. If you start giving everybody positive feedback all the time over every beneficial thing, it'll just be a sort of a ploy that you're using. Positive feedback is more impressive when it's distinct. When it's something, like literally you pulling that person aside and saying, I really want to communicate this to you, then it really stands out. And that person says, wow, they must have really seen this in me. And therefore I want to continue to do that. So I think, a good leader at any level in a team thinks about, when are my opportunities to use positive feedback? What are the things I would like my team to be doing that they're not doing? And almost have these ready. If I see somebody do that, okay, I want to use that as an opportunity to praise that behavior. And that will bring it out more in that person, but also probably in the others who see it as well. It'll show them that's something I value. And it's got the positive vibes to it, not that sort of fight flight kind of vibe to it.
For sure. It reminds me of the quote, something to the effect of, what you appreciate appreciates. So obviously, if they acknowledge the great behavior of speaking, then it grows, and hopefully it fosters more of that behavior as well. So you mentioned for positive feedback specific, are there other attributes that you'd want to kind of encourage folks to have for providing positive feedback as well?
It's really powerful when you highlight something that you think that person doesn't see as a strength, as a personal strength. And we can just kind of imagine this. We all view ourselves a certain way. We probably go into an environment thinking these are the things I'm good at. If somebody takes us aside and says, you're good at something that you probably don't even realize you're good at, that just sort of adds, a whole positive. It's like some new magic item we just got. Like, oh, I thought I was good at these things, but now I'm also good at something else. And I remember that a time when we spoke before, when I mentioned a professor of mine who, after reading some essays I wrote, said, you are a really good scientific thinker. You think like a scientist. And I never thought I thought like a scientist. I knew I enjoyed these things, but I didn't really think it was that distinct from other students. But he said, no, it is. You are particularly good at this, and you should consider going that direction. I felt different about myself walking away from that. And I do think that shaped my trajectory in life. And so I think those things, if you can tell somebody that they're good at something that they already know they're good at. Say they're a good presenter and they give a presentation,
Sure.
And you say, wow, that was a great presentation. That's probably good. But if they do something else, like, come up with a great creative idea or something like that, and you say, you are a really good creative thinker, we want you on more of these brainstorming sessions. If they didn't think they were, and now they do, wow, have you given them a gift? And you will see that blossom. You will see that flower.
That's amazing. So, definitely, if you acknowledge folks with other things, because sometimes you have a hard time internally to say, okay, I thought everybody's good at that. Isn't everybody good at that? But oftentimes other people can see it, and if you get that acknowledgement, then it's a lot more impactful for you. So
Yeah,
I'd love if you had any kind of everyday tips that you could share with folks to improve their receiving or giving feedback? Or do you have to wait for the assignment or the year-end review or something like that? Are there any things that you can do on a regular basis that would help in either of those cases, either constructive or positive, or any sort of aspect of feedback?
Well, one of the things I say, especially to my students, but I think it applies to everyone, is there are opportunities for us to gain knowledge about ourselves through feedback that we often throw away because of the fight flight, because of the negative emotionality. So, here's a potential example. Let's say you were interviewed for a job that you really wanted. You were hoping you were going to get it. And so you go through this formal interview process, and you get the phone call a few days later, and they say, I'm very sorry, we're going to go with somebody else. What do most of us do? We say, okay, thank you very much. We hang up the phone and we feel bad about ourselves and it stops there. In a situation like that, you just had a group of people formally assess you, and they found that some other individual had some quality that was attractive to them, that you didn't have, or at least not to the same extent. Wouldn't you like to know what that is? That information is sitting there somewhere. And quite often it's very easy to instead on that call say, I completely understand. I wish that individual all the luck on the job, but I would love to learn a little from this experience. And you guys just put me through this experience, and I'm sure there's some feedback. Is there any chance I could talk to any of the decision makers and find out, what it is I could do to be more attractive to you in the future? Just saying that. So I mean, there's two goodnesses to that. One is if they do that, if they follow through and give you some feedback, then you do have that information that you can use to improve. But the second thing is you're communicating to that person who has jobs that you like, because you interviewed one, that you are the kind of person that continually likes to grow. You're determined to become a better person all the time, and just sending that signal can make a difference when that next job opportunity comes along. And maybe they think, oh, remember that person we interviewed that we didn't pick that came back? Maybe we should interview them for this position. And so it creates a sort of positive. You're not angry because they didn't pick you. You're accepting, and you're able to control your emotionality, and you want to grow. And so I think that, two things, taking advantage of that opportunity, but that general mindset of realizing we're not going to get everything we want. I think it was Nelson Mandela's quote that I love that says, I don't always win every situation. I either win. No, sorry. He says, I always, I'm going to get this all wrong now. But the idea is in any situation, I either win or I learn. One of those two. Yeah. And so, if you have that mentality, it's just a really positive mentality to have. People like being around people who have that mentality. You're not as dangerous because you're not going to get mad if something negative happens to you. And it really will help you to continually grow and to be ready for other opportunities going forward.
For sure. That's one of my favorite quotes, never lose, win or learn, or something to that.
Oh, good. I'm glad you didn't have it nailed either.
So, that paraphrase, I'm sure there are different versions of it all around. But what I took from that is basically if there are ever those moments where you encounter kind of that fight or flight moment, maybe if you can, pause yourself and follow a little bit of curiosity. Well, why do you think that way? Is there anything that I could do differently about that? And obviously that's if you can get past that emotional part, because that would be probably a different podcast on its own on how to do that. But so that would help from a constructive feedback perspective. And I'd love if you had maybe one tip for positive feedback. Is it just about giving everyone compliments on a regular basis, or is there something else that we could kind of do today, tomorrow, to kind of help us activate our positive feedback muscles?
Let me give you a story to think about with that, because one of the things from psychology that's kind of interesting, and it often is described in a parenting kind of point of view. And so I'll do one of my other sort of fun examples. Let's say you're a parent, you occasionally have friends that come over, and you have a young child. And this young child, for whatever reason, comes running out at one point while you have friends over, completely naked. Now, when they do that, what's going to happen? Well, the people who are in the room are probably going to laugh and find it kind of funny, and that's a cute little kid. You might not find it so funny at the time, but this kid is going to get a bunch of positive feedback. You're going to be rewarded for that behavior by all the chuckling and all the fun that it produced. And so what's going to happen the next time you have friends over? Well, if you do nothing, this behavior will probably continue. And most people as a parent say, I don't really want that behavior to continue. And so now is your choice. Do you choose constructive feedback as your approach, or do you choose positive feedback? And so what I mean by that is you can talk to the child and you can say, I don't want you doing this anymore. What you're doing is inappropriate. And you can try to give it that whole constructive. And as soon as you do that, that child is going to feel like they're being judged. They're going to feel the negative emotions. And that's not the best thing for a parent-child bond, to have too many of those. If instead you say, hey, little Johnny, I'm going to have friends over today. If you come out fully dressed, then we'll go for an ice cream after the friends leave. And so now we're going to focus on the positive, rewarding the behavior we want. And so now if Johnny comes out with a fully dressed, we reward him, and we might even tell the friends, we might even give them a heads up. If you could say, wow, what a young gentleman you look like, or wow, what a big boy you are, the kinds of things we know kids like to hear. You give them the positive feedback for the behavior you want. And that's often much more powerful than the constructive feedback for the behavior you don't want. So if you can ever, for positive feedback, if you can ever say, hey, what's a way I can use positive feedback to undo that negative behavior? That is a much more powerful approach. It breeds a situation where people like each other and trust each other. And it really is about trust. And whether you're this is your team or this is your child, it's the sort of same notion that when you can use positive, selectively, then use it. It's the preferred approach. But every now and then you're going to have to use constructive. Constructive is sort of easier and more direct. You see the behavior you don't like, you talk to the person about it. But the positive is actually the more powerful way to go.
Sounds good. I think that's a good wrap up for a place to wrap up for our discussion on feedback. So we talked about a whole bunch of different things that, feedback's hard to receive, mainly because of our biology. Fight or flight, it's pretty challenging there.
Yeah.
Things like self-determination theory also plays a role in it as well. And even referring to it as feed forward can be helpful as well in order to change kind of the narrative of it as well. And the more that we can move towards positive feedback versus just constructive feedback, then that can also improve things as well.
Good summary.
Are there any other pieces of well, thank you. I appreciate that feedback or the feed forward.
There you go.
that positive feedback. There you go. So are there any other tidbits that we haven't covered about feedback, about giving, receiving that you would want to impart on folks as we kind of close off the podcast?
Well, the one thing I would mention is one of the reasons we love to focus on feedback in our use of the educational technology. You mentioned Peer Scholar. So we are using feedback or putting students through that process of giving and receiving feedbacks for two reasons. One is to literally enhance their communication skills, that socio-emotional communication, make them better communicators. But the other thing is, once you understand the challenge of constructive feedback, especially if you now have to look at a fellow student's work and you have to tell them some way it could be better, in order to do that, you have to engage a bunch of the other skills that we really love. And those are skills like critical thinking. So you have to, first of all, read it carefully, which we call receptive communication. Many of us need to learn how to shut up and listen to others. And so we have to teach people, listen to what this person is saying, but then combine that with critical thinking to find areas where maybe they could have said it better or their argument could be clearer. And then once you find those, let's call it weaknesses, now you got to use creative thought to say, well, what advice do I have for this person? Do I have any suggestion about how they could do this better? And then you kick in that socio-emotional communication. And then you communicate that idea in a way that hopefully won't trigger fight flight. So for us, putting students through this process, especially when you ask them to give feedback to multiple peers, it becomes a context where we're exercising their critical thought, their creative thought, their communication skills, and when it's in a team environment, their collaboration skills as well. And so for us, feedback has become a context for creating sort of a gym of the mind where these skills, we live in this day of chat GPT and stuff, and we know that the skills students need are those high level critical thinking, creative thinking, communication, collaboration. And so now this giving and receiving of feedback becomes a context we can use to really exercise those skills in the way that you would go to karate and exercise certain skills and see improvement of them. And so, for us, the technology is both about the feedback and the communication, but it's also an excuse to find a way to really develop these skills in students as they're with us at our institutions.
I think that's awesome. I love what you said about the kind of gym of the mind, because this is not a one-shot deal where you learn it once. It's a constant evolution, and it just highlights the importance of feedback and what people dub as these soft skills, which are a little bit more vague and enigmatic. But there is a way of improving them, going to this gym and getting better. And with better students, you have better leaders, better people. So here's Steve Joordens looking to make the world a better place. So that's fantastic and awesome. And thanks, Steve, for sharing your insights on how to give better feedback, how to receive feedback in a better way. And hopefully we'll have you back for a future episode.
I look forward to it very much, my friend. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Take care.
Thanks for joining us on the SWIKE, Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier, the podcast. If you like the podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you found this podcast. And if you can give us a review, that would be very appreciated. Feel free to contact me on LinkedIn at Luki Danu, LUKIDANU, and the same on most social media platforms. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Bye.